Get away from her file. Now.
It's not what it looks like, Barrett. You're holding a sealed exhibit list in my house.
Tell me what else it's supposed to look like. I was double-checking the protective order addresses, making sure nothing on this list points back to your street. Then why is Adeline's school pickup time circled in the margin? That's not my handwriting. It's your pen. It's in your hand. Barrett, I have known her since she was in diapers.
I would never.
Then put the file on the desk and step back from the cabinet. How long have you had a key to this house? Since your wife left. You gave it to me yourself for the nights you got called in and needed someone to sit with Adeline. I'm asking how long you've been coming in here without me. I haven't.
Then explain the cabinet.
I let myself in 20 minutes ago because your office called me, worried you weren't answering your phone during a case update.
I found the file already out on your desk, and I panicked, because I didn't want it sitting somewhere Adeline could stumble onto it. Barrett crossed the room and picked up the page himself, turning it toward the lamp. The margin note wasn't just a circle. It was a time, written small, 3:15, and beneath it, in the same hand, a street name that was not on any court document, not on any protective order, not anywhere in the case file at all. It was the cross street outside Adeline's elementary school. That's not a security note, Weston. That's a schedule. I can explain that, then explain it to Adeline's face, because she's asleep down the hall right now. And I need you to tell me exactly why a man I have trusted with this office for 11 years has her pickup time written next to a sealed grand jury exhibit. Ferris said nothing. For one long second, something moved behind his eyes that Barrett had never seen there before. Not in 11 years, not once. And it looked less like guilt than it looked like fear. "Get out of my house," Barrett said. "We'll talk in my office tomorrow. On the record, with a witness in the room. Never come through that door again without me standing in it." Ferris left without another word. Barrett stood alone in the office a long moment after the front door clicked shut, then walked down the hall and eased Adeline's door open, just far enough to see her asleep, one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress, entirely unaware that a stranger's handwriting had circled the exact minute she'd be standing outside her school alone. Barrett Nash was 43 years old, the elected district attorney of Millbrook County, a job he'd won 11 years ago on a promise to actually try the cases nobody else wanted to touch. His wife had left 4 years back, not dramatically, just steadily, the way people leave marriages that have already been over for a while, and she'd moved to the coast without asking for custody of anything but a storage unit full of furniture. Barrett had raised Adeline alone since, and the county's political class had never quite forgiven him for it, treating a single father in a high-profile office as a liability to be managed rather than a man doing his job. He'd heard the whispers at fundraisers, that he was distracted, that he brought his daughter to work events when he shouldn't, that a man raising a daughter alone couldn't be trusted with the county's most dangerous prosecutions. He had never once let the whispers change how carefully he read a file. Adeline was 11, watchful in the specific way of children who spend a lot of quiet evenings doing homework in the corner of an adult's office, absorbing more of the room than anyone realized. She noticed things. She remembered license plates, remembered which visitors used the side door instead of the front, remembered exactly how many sugars her father took in his coffee, down to the half spoon. And she had never once complained about the nights he came home late, because she understood, in her own 11-year-old way, that his job meant something to people who had nobody else fighting for them. Weston Ferris had been the chief investigator of the district attorney's office for 11 years. A former county detective Barrett had personally recruited when he first took the job, a broad, unhurried man who had taught Barrett more about reading a witness than 3 years of law school ever had. He was the only person, besides Adeline's grandmother, that Barrett trusted with a key to his house. The doubts about Barrett's fitness for the office had never been loud, only persistent, the kind of quiet erosion that came out at county fundraisers where donors asked, gently, whether he'd considered bringing on a deputy district attorney to handle the heavier caseload, given everything on his plate at home. He'd heard a commissioner joke once, within earshot on purpose, that Barrett Nash ran the best organized nursery school and the second best organized district attorney's office in the state. He never dignified it with an argument. He simply kept winning the cases nobody else wanted to try and let the winds speak for whatever the whispers refused to. The case that had consumed the last 14 months of Barrett's life involved Ashgrove Distribution Group, a regional pharmaceutical logistics company owned by a soft-spoken businessman named Nolan Weller, suspected of diverting truckloads of prescription painkillers off legitimate delivery routes and into a black market that stretched across 3 counties. It was the largest case Barrett's office had ever built, and it depended entirely on a handful of witnesses whose addresses were supposed to exist in exactly one place. The sealed exhibit list Weston Ferris had been holding in Barrett's home office at 11 o'clock at night. Barrett didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table with the marked page in front of him, running his thumb along the circled time the way a man checks a wound to see if it's still bleeding, and by morning he had already decided one thing with total certainty. Whatever Weston Ferris was involved in, it was no longer a question of whether his daughter was safe. It was a question of how much time he had left to make sure she stayed that way. He called Ferris into his office the next morning with the door open and a court reporter present, a precise, unhurried woman named Sylvia Kemp who sat in the corner with her stenotype machine already running by the time Ferris walked in. "I want this on the record," Barrett said. "Last night, at approximately 10:40, I found you in my home office holding a sealed grand jury exhibit list with my daughter's school pickup time written in the margin. I want your explanation, in full, right now." "I already gave you my explanation." "Give it again, slower." Ferris sat down across the desk, arms folded, his voice steady in the particular way of a man who had rehearsed steady voices for a living. "Your office called me at 9:40 because you weren't answering your cell. I drove over to check on you and Adeline both. Out of habit, more than protocol. Your home office door was open. The exhibit list was already sitting on your desk, not locked away like it should have been. I picked it up to secure it. And yes, I made a note about the school cross street, because part of my job for the last 14 months has been flagging any address on that list that sits within half a mile of anywhere your family goes. That's not a leak, Barrett. That's the job you assigned me. I never assigned you a job that puts a specific minute of my daughter's day into your handwriting. I write down times out of habit. Ask anyone in this building. I'm asking you. Then my answer is the same one I just gave you. And I'd like it noted for the record that I've served this office for 11 years without a single complaint against me. And I resent being treated like a suspect over a margin note made in good faith." Barrett studied him for a long moment. The same unhurried read he gave every witness who was either telling the truth or had simply told the same lie enough times to believe it. He couldn't tell which, not yet, and that uncertainty scared him more than an outright confession would have. Sylvia Kemp kept typing through the silence, the soft clatter of the stenotype the only sound in the room, and Barrett found himself grateful for it, a small mechanical proof that whatever happened next would exist somewhere outside his own memory, unable to be quietly rewritten later by either of them. "You're reassigned off the Weller case, effective this morning," Barrett said. "Desk duty, full pay, until this is resolved." "That's a mistake. You need someone who knows this case cold in that courtroom, and right now, that's me. That's exactly why you're the first person I have to remove from it." Ferris left without arguing further, which unsettled Barrett more than an argument would have. Guilty men fought reassignments. Ferris had simply absorbed it, the posture of someone already 3 moves ahead, calculating a different problem entirely. Barrett sat alone in his office long after Ferris had gone, staring at 11 years of case files he and Ferris had built together, convictions that had put genuinely dangerous people away, testimony Ferris had coaxed out of terrified witnesses with a patience Barrett himself had never quite mastered. None of that history erased the margin note. It only made the margin note harder to hold next to everything he thought he'd known about the man. The confirmation came 2 days later, in the worst possible way. Corwin Blake, the state's key witness against Ashgrove Distribution Group, a former warehouse dispatcher who had agreed to testify about falsified delivery manifests, was walking to his car outside a relocated safe address when a sedan pulled alongside him and a passenger stepped out fast enough that Blake dropped his keys and ran. Nothing happened beyond a shove and a shouted threat. No gunfire, no arrest. The sedan gone before a neighbor's doorbell camera caught more than a blurred plate. But the address itself told Barrett everything he needed to know. Only 4 people in the world had access to that safe address: Barrett, Eleanor Bragg from the Sheriff's Department Liaison Unit, the prosecutor assigned second chair, and Weston Ferris. Barrett drove to the safe house himself that night, found Blake sitting on the porch steps with his hands still shaking, a blanket someone had draped over his shoulders that he hadn't noticed enough to pull tight. "They knew exactly where I was," Blake said. "Not the old address, the new one. I moved here 6 days ago. Who else did you tell?" "Nobody. My sister doesn't even have it." Barrett sat down beside him on the steps, the porch light drawing the first moths of the evening in slow, aimless circles. "I'm going to find out how they knew. And I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen again. I need you to trust me a little longer." "I trusted you before too," Blake said. Not unkindly, just tired. "I trusted the whole system. Somebody in it just tried to get me hurt." Blake had agreed to testify against Ashgrove Distribution Group 4 months earlier, after 2 years of watching pallets of prescription medication get rerouted through paperwork he'd personally been ordered to falsify, a decision that had cost him his job, his apartment lease, and most of his old friendships in the warehouse district practically overnight. He'd told Barrett once, early on, that he wasn't testifying to be a hero. He was testifying because he had a nephew who'd nearly died of an overdose 2 years back, pills that had come from somewhere nobody could ever quite trace. And he'd decided he would rather lose everything he had than spend the rest of his life wondering if he'd helped move the exact batch that did it. Barrett called Eleanor Bragg from his car in the driveway before he'd even started the engine. She was young for internal affairs work, 31, sharp-eyed, the kind of investigator who had made a habit of double-checking her own conclusions before she ever brought them to anyone else. She'd transferred into the liaison unit 3 years earlier, after a decorated stretch investigating officer misconduct in a much larger department to the south, a job she'd left, she'd told Barrett once, because she'd grown tired of watching cases quietly die in exactly the kind of drawer Weston Ferris apparently had access to. "I need a formal internal inquiry," Barrett told her. "Not a conversation. A file, a case number, a paper trail that exists whether or not I'm the one signing it." "On Ferris?" "On the safe house address. I want to know every hand that address passed through, and I want you looking at Weston specifically, but I don't want it to look like I decided the answer before you opened the file." "You already have decided, though." "I have a suspicion," Barrett said. "I need someone else to tell me if I'm right. Because if I'm wrong about this, I've just ended the career of the best investigator I've ever worked with over a coincidence. And if you're right, then I need to know exactly how far it goes before it reaches my daughter." Eleanor opened the inquiry the next morning, and within a week, the person who would actually crack the case open wasn't Eleanor at all, but a woman almost nobody in the building thought to ask anything of. Opal Grissom had run the evidence records room for the district attorney's office for 19 years, a soft-spoken woman in her early 60s whom 2 different supervisors had passed over for the records manager promotion, in favor of younger candidates with less institutional memory and considerably less patience for detail. She was also the only person left in the building who still resealed every returned evidence box by hand, folding the tamper tape into the same small double crease she'd used since her very first week on the job, a habit so old and automatic she'd stopped thinking about it years ago. Right up until the Tuesday, she noticed 2 boxes on the shelf that didn't have it. She found Barrett in the break room 2 days after Eleanor's inquiry opened, setting both boxes on the table between them without waiting to be asked. "I heard there's a question about who's been in the vault," Opal said. "I want to show you something before Eleanor's report even gets typed up." She turned the lids toward him. "Look at the corners of the tape. Every box I've resealed in 19 years gets the same fold, twice, so it lies flat without a bubble. These 2 don't have my fold. Somebody opened them and closed them back up, trying to make it look untouched. They almost got it right." "These dates are from the Halvorsen prosecution," Barrett said, reading the case labels. "That case closed 6 years ago. And this one," Opal set her hand on the second box, "was the Prentice embezzlement case. Closed 4 years ago. I checked the vault's regular badge log against both dates once I noticed the tape." Weston swiped in that week, both times, same as a dozen other routine days that year. The log itself doesn't look wrong. It only looks wrong once you already know what the seal is supposed to look like, and a log can't tell you that. Only the tape can. Opal had been passed over for the records manager position twice in the last 6 years, both times in favor of younger hires from outside the department who lasted, on average, under 2 years before moving on to something else entirely. leaving Opal to quietly retrain whoever came next on a job only she truly understood. She'd never filed a formal complaint about it. She'd simply kept doing the work the same careful way for 19 years, because she'd decided long ago that the work mattered more than whether anyone above her noticed who was doing it. You're telling me this has happened before? I'm telling you, it's happened at least twice before, going back further than this Weller case, further than anything either of us has thought to look at until right now. Opal folded her hands on the table, steady despite the weight of what she'd just laid out. Nobody ever asked the records clerk anything, Barrett. I've watched things pass through that vault for 19 years that nobody else in this building has bothered to notice. I noticed these. Eleanor Bragg's formal inquiry moved fast once Opal's tape discrepancy became part of the file. Cross-referencing the vault's existing badge swipe, timestamps against courthouse parking records, and cell tower pings pulled under a judicial order, Barrett signed himself, careful to keep his own hand out of anything that touched the actual gathering of evidence. What came back, 3 days later, connected Weston Ferris to a phone number registered to a shell address in a neighboring county, a number that had exchanged calls with Ferris's personal cell on the exact evenings before both the Halverson and Prentice cases had quietly collapsed years earlier, and again, more frequently now in the weeks since the Ashgrove Distribution Group investigation had gone from a rumor to an indictment. The shell address traces to a property management company, Eleanor said, laying the printout across Barrett's desk, which traces to a holding company, which traces after 3 more layers to Nolan Weller personally. So Weller's been buying Ferris for years. I don't think buying is the right word, Eleanor said. There's no unusual money in Weston's accounts. No new car, no second mortgage paid off, nothing that looks like payment. Whatever's keeping him tied to that number, it isn't cash. It was Opal, again, who found the piece that finally explained it. This time, not through tape or a log at all, but through an old case file she remembered filing personally, decades before Barrett had ever taken office. 24 years earlier, a young beat officer named Weston Ferris had been the arresting officer in an armed robbery case against a warehouse stock clerk named Julian Frey. The physical evidence had been thin from the start, and a defense alibi witness had come forward days before trial claiming Frey had been at her apartment the entire night in question. That witness statement, according to the case log Opal pulled, had been checked into evidence and never checked back out. It had simply vanished before trial. Frey was convicted on the strength of a shaky eyewitness identification and served 19 years before a post-conviction DNA review, run by an entirely different office, decades later, finally cleared him. The file itself was thin compared to the weight of what it had cost. A single arrest report, a property inventory, a witness statement checked into evidence and never checked back out, and a conviction that had taken 19 years of Julian Frey's life on the strength of everything that remained after the one document that could have saved him quietly disappeared. Barrett read the file twice, then a third time, before he understood what he was looking at. Ferris made this evidence disappear, Barrett said, 24 years ago, before I ever knew him. It gets worse, Opal said quietly. I pulled the property records on that alibi witness's old apartment building out of nothing but a hunch. It was owned, back then, under a different name, by a company that eventually became part of Nolan Weller's holdings. Weller didn't find this by accident, Barrett. He's owned the paper trail, proving what Weston did for 24 years. He's just been waiting for a reason to use it. Barrett sat with that for a long moment, the office quiet, except for the hum of the overhead light. If someone holds the worst thing you've ever done over your head long enough, he said, half to himself, half to the room, eventually you stop being afraid of getting caught for the new thing. You're already convinced you deserve whatever happens to you for the old one. Eleanor set the property records down on the desk, careful not to let her voice soften too far into sympathy for a man who had, after everything, still chosen to keep going along with it. That's not an excuse for what he's doing to Corwin Blake, she said, or what he almost did to your daughter. Sympathy for how a man got trapped doesn't undo what he chose to do once he was in it. I'm not excusing it, Barrett said. I'm trying to understand it, because a man who spent 24 years afraid of one secret doesn't stop being dangerous just because we've finally named it. If anything, cornered like this, he's more dangerous now than he's ever been. The conversation that finally connected every loose thread happened that same evening at the kitchen table, over a dinner Adeline had barely touched. Barrett had been watching her pick at her food for 10 minutes before she finally set her fork down, entirely. "Can I tell you something you're going to be mad about?" she said. "I'm not going to be mad. You might be a little mad. Tell me anyway." 2 months ago, Uncle Weston picked me up from the park near school. Just once. He said you'd asked him to, because you got stuck at the courthouse. Adeline's eyes stayed fixed on her plate. "We got ice cream. He asked me a bunch of questions about your work schedule, like what days you usually got home late. I didn't think it was weird at the time. He's Uncle Weston." "What flavor?" Barrett asked, gently, because it was the only question that came to him that wasn't going to frighten her further. "Mint chip. He got plain vanilla, which I remember thinking was boring for a grown man who could pick anything." Barrett almost laughed, despite everything. The specific relief of hearing his daughter notice ice cream flavors instead of danger, and then the weight of it settled back over him just as fast. Barrett kept his voice level with an effort that cost him more than any cross-examination he'd ever conducted. "Did I actually ask him to pick you up that day?" "I don't know. I just believed him." "That's not your fault," Barrett said. "That was never supposed to be a question you had to ask yourself." He didn't sleep again that night either, but this time it wasn't uncertainty keeping him awake. It was clarity, cold and complete, the specific kind that only arrives once every remaining question has already been answered, and all that's left is deciding what to do about it. Barrett saw Nolan Weller in person only once before the grain co-op, at a county chamber of commerce dinner. Neither man could gracefully skip without drawing attention to the exact tension everyone in the room was pretending not to notice. Weller approached him near the dessert table, soft-spoken as ever, a trim, unremarkable man who looked more like a tax accountant than the center of a felony indictment. "District Attorney Nash," Weller said, extending a hand Barrett didn't take. "I hope this case of yours isn't taking too much time away from your daughter. I understand she's at that age where a father's attention matters most." "I appreciate the concern," Barrett said. "I'll manage my time. You should worry about managing your defense." "I always do." Weller smiled, unbothered, and lowered his voice just enough to make the words feel private between them. "You've built a career on believing the system protects people who tell the truth, Mr. Nash. I'd hate for you to learn the hard way how many places that belief has blind spots." He glanced deliberately toward the far side of the room where a small group of county employees stood near the bar, a gesture so subtle Barrett almost missed the point of it entirely. "I know a great many people in this building. Some of them have worked for you for years. Is that a threat?" "It's an observation," Weller said, "from a man who's lived a great deal longer than you have." He turned and walked away before Barrett could answer, unhurried, entirely at ease, the posture of a man who had never once in his life expected consequences to catch up with him before he was ready for them. Barrett watched him go, aware of exactly how many other conversations in that room had probably unfolded the same way over the years, quiet, civil, and utterly without consequence, until now. Eleanor's wiretap authorization came through 2 days later, narrow in scope, limited to the shell number Ferris had been calling, but it was enough. The first intercepted call gave Barrett the confirmation he'd already privately accepted and still wasn't ready to hear out loud. "He's asking for more than addresses now," Eleanor said, sliding the transcript across the desk. "Listen to this section, second paragraph." Barrett read it in silence. A man identified only as Chester on the call. Weller's fixer, according to Eleanor's earlier surveillance, told Ferris plainly that a subpoena was closing in on the shell company's financial records, and that the only way to stop it in time was to remove the actual evidence drive from Barrett's home safe before the grand jury reconvened. Ferris had objected, weakly, and Chester had cut him off within seconds. "You already crossed the line that mattered 11 months ago," Chester's voice read on the transcript. "This is just finishing the job you started. Get the drive, or we start talking to reporters about a wrongful conviction you're personally responsible for." "And if getting the drive doesn't work," Ferris had asked, "what then?" "Then we make sure the district attorney has something more urgent to worry about than a subpoena. He's got a daughter who walks the same 4 blocks home from school every single day." Barrett set the transcript down carefully, the way a man sets down something that might shatter if handled wrong. "They're planning to use Adeline as leverage if the drive doesn't work." "That's how I read it too," Eleanor said, "which means we don't have the luxury of waiting for a slow, careful case anymore. We need to move before Ferris decides which threat feels safer to carry out." Eleanor spent the better part of an afternoon walking Barrett through exactly what the wiretap order would and would not allow, careful to keep the two of them on the correct side of a line that mattered as much to Barrett as the outcome itself. This authorization covers the shell number and any device that calls it directly, she said. It does not cover your home phone. It does not cover Adeline's tablet. And it does not cover anything Weston says to you in person without a device present. I need you to understand that boundary better than anyone in this building, because if we cross it even once, a defense attorney will use it to unravel everything else we've built. I understand it, Barrett said. I've spent 14 months building a case the right way. I'm not about to lose it in the last 2 weeks because I got impatient. I know, Eleanor said. I'm saying it out loud anyway, because impatient is exactly how a man with a scared child at home starts making mistakes he wouldn't otherwise make. I've seen it happen to better investigators than either of us. Barrett called the meeting that night in Opal's records room. After hours, blinds drawn, 3 people, and 1 plan laid out across a table, usually reserved for evidence logs. Opal had already built the piece that made the trap possible. A duplicate exhibit list, identical in every visible way to the real one, except for a single, altered detail, buried in an evidence description that meant nothing to anyone except the 3 people in that room, and a hidden tracking marker embedded in the document's file metadata that would ping the moment it was opened outside the building's secured network. If Ferris takes the bait and copies this version instead of the real one, Opal said, we'll know the second it leaves this building, and we'll know exactly where it goes. And if he goes for the safe at my house instead, Barrett said, the real drive won't be there. I'm moving it tonight into evidence custody under Eleanor's authority, not mine, so nobody can claim later that I tampered with anything myself. He'll know something's wrong the moment he opens a decoy file with the wrong file size, Eleanor said, studying the duplicate list one more time. You built this well, Opal, but Weston spent 11 years learning exactly how these documents are supposed to look and feel. I didn't just change the visible text, Opal said. I matched the original's metadata byte for byte, down to the creation timestamp. The only difference lives in a single field even Weston doesn't know exists, because I'm the only person in this building who's ever had to. That still leaves Adeline exposed if this goes wrong, Eleanor said. It won't, Barrett said, more certainty in his voice than he entirely felt. Starting tomorrow, she's not walking those 4 blocks alone, and she's not going to know why, because I'm not putting that fear on her unless I absolutely have to. He arranged it through a retired sheriff's deputy named Dwight Callahan, a family friend from before Adeline was born, a broad, unremarkable man in a work truck who picked up landscaping jobs around the school district and would, starting the next morning, happen to be trimming hedges along Adeline's walking route every single afternoon for the foreseeable future. Nobody watching from a distance would think twice about him. That was the entire point. Dwight had known Barrett since law school, long before either of them had a badge or a daughter to worry about. And when Barrett called him that night and explained only as much as he needed to, Dwight hadn't asked a single unnecessary question. You don't have to explain the whole thing, Dwight said. You need eyes on her that don't look like eyes. I can do that in my sleep. I owe you for this. You don't owe me anything. Just tell me when it's over so I can stop pretending your hedges need trimming twice a week. Dwight paused before hanging up. For what it's worth, I still remember you studying for the bar exam at my kitchen table at 2 a.m. You didn't quit then either. Adeline noticed him on the 3rd afternoon, waved at him the way she waved at every familiar adult in the neighborhood, and never once asked why a man she barely knew had suddenly taken an interest in landscaping along her walking route. Barrett found himself grateful every single day that week for exactly how little his daughter noticed the world bending itself quietly around her for her own protection. The decoy exhibit list went into circulation through the ordinary evidence request system 2 days later, routed specifically through Ferris's desk under a routine cover story about updated witness contact information, the kind of request that crossed his desk a dozen times a month. Barrett watched him take it without any visible hesitation, fold it into a case folder, and carry it out of the building at the end of his shift like any other Tuesday. The tracking marker pinged at 9:17 that night, from a location 11 miles outside the city limits, an old grain co-op building that hadn't operated in years, sitting alone at the end of a gravel access road with a single security light burning over its loading dock. That's not a courthouse annex or a records office, Eleanor said, staring at the map on her laptop. That's the middle of nowhere. It's exactly the kind of place you'd choose for a handoff nobody's supposed to witness, Barrett said. He was already reaching for his coat, Get a unit moving toward Adeline's route right now, just in case this is a distraction and not the real move. I want eyes on Dwight Callahan, confirming she's exactly where she's supposed to be before either of us takes one step toward that grain co-op. Eleanor made the call. The confirmation came back within 90 seconds. Adeline was safely at a friend's house 3 streets over, exactly where the after-school plan had placed her. Dwight parked in plain sight at the curb with a thermos of coffee and absolutely nothing that looked like urgency. "She's fine," Eleanor said. "Whatever's happening at that grain co-op, it's not a diversion. It's the real thing." Barrett nodded once, already moving toward the door. "Then let's go find out exactly how far Weston Ferris is willing to go before he finally runs out of road." The grain co-op sat dark, except for the single security light over the loading dock, casting a narrow yellow circle across cracked concrete and a rusted grain auger nobody had touched in a decade. Barrett watched from the tree line with Eleanor and 2 plainclothes deputies, close enough to see Ferris pacing beside his own truck, the decoy exhibit list rolled tight in one fist. A second vehicle pulled in without headlights. A heavy-set man climbed out, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done this before, and Barrett recognized the voice from the wiretap transcript before he ever saw the face clearly. "Chester," Ferris said, "this is the last one. I mean it." "You said that about the last one, too." Chester Vale held out a gloved hand. "Give me the list." Ferris hesitated, the rolled page halfway extended, close enough that Barrett could see his hand shaking under the security light. "Something wrong with it? I want your word that this ends here. No more calls, no more addresses, nothing about his daughter ever again." Chester laughed, short and unimpressed. "You don't get to negotiate terms 24 years after the fact. Give me the list, or I make the call about his daughter's school schedule, myself tonight. And this time, nobody's going to be reasonable about it." That was the moment Barrett stepped out of the tree line, his voice carrying flat and clear across the open lot. "Nobody's making any calls tonight, Chester." Chester Vale turned fast, his hand dropping toward his jacket, and for one full second, the entire lot seemed to hold its breath. Deputies moving in from both flanks with weapons raised. Eleanor shouting a command Barrett barely registered over the sound of his own pulse. Chester froze halfway through the motion, hand still inside his jacket, calculating odds that had just collapsed to nothing. "Hands where I can see them," Eleanor said. "Now." Chester complied, slow and furious, and a deputy had him against the truck within seconds, the gun in his jacket recovered and cleared before anyone exhaled. For one terrible half-second before the deputies closed the distance, the barrel had swept close enough to Barrett's direction that Eleanor had physically stepped in front of him, an instinct neither of them discussed afterward, both of them understanding it without needing to. Ferris hadn't moved at all, the rolled exhibit list still in his hand, staring at Barrett across 15 feet of cracked concrete like a man watching the last version of his own excuse burn down in real time. "It's over, Weston," Barrett said. "You don't understand what he had on me. I know exactly what he had on you. Julian Frey served 19 years for a robbery you helped bury the evidence on. I've read the file 3 times. Something in Ferris's face finally broke. The practiced steadiness of 11 years cracking all at once, and he sat down hard on the tailgate of his own truck, the decoy list falling from his hand onto the concrete. "I was 29 years old," Ferris said. "I made one mistake that ruined a man's whole life, and I have spent every single day since then waiting for someone to finally make me pay for it." When Weller found the file, some part of me almost felt relieved, like the bill had finally come due. "You could have come to me any day in 11 years. And told you what? That I put an innocent man in prison and buried the one piece of paper that could have saved him. You'd have ended my career and been right to do it." "I'm ending it now anyway," Barrett said. "But there's a difference between ending a career and ending everything, Weston. You still have a choice about which one this becomes." Ferris looked up at him, eyes wet in the security light, and for the first time in 11 years, Barrett watched something like relief actually reach the man's face. "I'll tell you everything," Ferris said. "The wiretap, the payments, Weller made to keep Julian Frey's exoneration file buried until now. All of it. I want it on the record. I want Julian Frey to finally hear the whole truth from someone who was actually there." Eleanor already had a recorder running. Ferris talked for 40 minutes without stopping, and by the time the deputies led him to a car, the outline of Nolan Weller's entire operation, the diverted pharmaceuticals, the buried exoneration file, the 11 months of leaked case information, sat recorded in full, undeniable. Exactly the kind of evidence that left no room for a defense attorney to argue coincidence. Nolan Weller was arrested at his home 3 days later, charged with witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. The pharmaceutical diversion case Barrett had spent 14 months building finally strong enough to stand entirely on its own. He said nothing to the arresting deputies, offered no version of the unbothered composure he'd worn at the Chamber of Commerce dinner, and Barrett heard secondhand that he'd spent his one phone call not on a lawyer but on his property manager, arguing about a missed rent payment on a building he'd likely never see again. Chester Vale took a plea agreement within a week, naming 2 more associates in exchange for a reduced sentence. Weston Ferris pleaded guilty to obstruction and evidence tampering, both the recent leaks and the 24-year-old cover-up, and asked the court, through his own attorney, that his full statement be read into the record at Julian Frey's exoneration hearing rather than sealed as part of a private plea deal. At his own sentencing 2 months later, Ferris declined to speak in his own defense, waiving his allocution entirely, and simply stood while the judge handed down a term that would keep him well past his 60th birthday, a sentence he received without any visible reaction at all, as though some part of him had already served it, quietly, for 24 years before the courtroom ever caught up. Barrett stood in the back of that courtroom the day it happened, not as the prosecutor, since he'd recused his own office from any proceeding touching Ferris's original case, but simply as a witness to it. Julian Frey was 51 years old now, gray at the temples, a man who had spent 19 years insisting on a truth nobody in power had been willing to hear. When the judge read the formal exoneration into the record, Frey didn't cry, didn't speak, just closed his eyes for a long moment and let out a breath that looked like it had been held for almost 2 decades. Frey's daughter, a woman in her late 20s, who had been 6 years old the last time she'd seen her father outside a visitation room, sat beside him through the whole hearing, gripping his hand so tightly her knuckles had gone pale by the time the judge finished speaking. Barrett watched them from the back row and thought, not for the first time that year, about how much of justice was really just this, giving people back the ordinary, unremarkable years nobody had ever meant to take from them in the first place. Afterward, in the courthouse hallway, Frey found Barrett waiting near the elevator. "You didn't have to come," Frey said. "I wanted to hear it in person," Barrett said. "I'm sorry it took this long. 19 years, I told anybody who'd listen that the evidence disappeared on purpose. Nobody believed me until a records clerk nobody respects and a prosecutor with a scared kid at home finally had a reason to look." Frey extended his hand. "That's not nothing." Corwin Blake testified against Ashgrove Distribution Group 6 weeks later, in a courtroom with security measures Barrett had personally overseen this time, nothing left to a system that had already failed him once. Blake's hands shook through the first 10 minutes of his testimony and steadied completely by the end. And when the jury returned a guilty verdict on every count, he found Barrett in the hallway afterward and shook his hand without saying much of anything at all, the kind of silence that carried more than words would have. Millbrook County held a press conference the following week, not for Barrett's benefit, though the county commissioners, who had once whispered about his fitness for office now, stood visibly eager to be photographed beside him. Barrett kept his remarks short, crediting Opal Grissom and Eleanor Bragg by name, refusing every invitation to frame the case as a personal vindication rather than a systemic failure, finally corrected. Eleanor used the momentum from the case to push through a policy change she'd been drafting quietly for 2 years, requiring any sealed evidence checkout to require 2 independent sign-offs instead of 1, a small procedural fix that would have caught Weston Ferris on his very first unauthorized visit to that vault if it had existed 11 years earlier. She told Barrett, half joking, that she intended to name it after nobody in particular, because the point wasn't whose name went on a policy. The point was that it would simply exist the next time somebody needed it to. The county's Conviction Review Unit, prompted directly by Julian Frey's exoneration, reopened both the Halverson and Prentice cases within the month, the 2 prior matters Opal's sharp eye had first flagged. Neither reopening produced anything as dramatic as a wrongful conviction, but both revealed smaller irregularities in how evidence had been handled. Irregularities that led, quietly and without fanfare, to 2 new department policies bearing Opal's fingerprints, even though her name never appeared on either one. At home that evening, Adeline sat at the kitchen table doing homework while Barrett made dinner. The ordinary rhythm of a Tuesday restored in a way that felt, for the first time in weeks, unremarkable. "Are we safe now?" she asked, not looking up from her math worksheet. The question asked with the same plainness she asked everything. "We're safe," Barrett said, "and I owe you an apology for how long it took me to notice something was wrong, before you had to be the one to tell me." "You noticed the file first," Adeline said. "I just noticed the ice cream." "Both mattered," Barrett said. "That's usually how it works. Nobody sees the whole picture alone." She thought about that for a moment, chewing the end of her pencil, the way she did when she was working something out that had nothing to do with math. "Is Uncle Weston going to prison forever?" "A very long time," Barrett said. "Long enough that it isn't really about you and me anymore. It's about a debt he's owed somebody else for a lot longer than you've been alive." "That's sad," she said simply, without any performance in it. "I liked him. I'm still allowed to be a little sad about that, right? Even though what he did was wrong." "You're allowed to feel both at once," Barrett said. "Most true things about people usually need both." Barrett brought Adeline by the records room one afternoon that same week, mostly because she'd asked, after hearing her father mention Opal's name at the dinner table more times than any other in the whole ordeal. Opal came around her desk to shake Adeline's hand with the same seriousness she'd have offered any adult, then picked up a roll of tamper tape and an empty box lid and showed her the fold, twice, so it lay flat. "Anybody can look at a shelf full of boxes and see nothing worth a second glance," Opal said. "I like to think it's still worth noticing the small things carefully, even when nobody's watching to say thank you." "That's kind of like noticing the ice cream," Adeline said, and Barrett, standing in the doorway, felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in weeks. Opal laughed at that, a real laugh, and told Adeline she was welcome in the records room any Saturday she wanted to learn how the vault actually worked, an offer Adeline would take her up on more than once in the months that followed. Opal Grissom was promoted to records manager within the month, the position she should have held years earlier, and she used her first act in the new role to formalize a mandatory second inspection on every reopened evidence box. A fold checked against a fold instead of a log entry taken on faith, ensuring no future clerk would have to fight, uncredited, to be believed the way she once had. Barrett kept the decoy exhibit list in his own desk drawer afterward, the page with its single altered detail that had drawn the truth out into the open, a reminder that the surest way to expose what's hidden in a locked room is sometimes simply to leave the right door unlocked and wait to see who walks through it. Some nights that summer, Barrett still caught himself pausing in the hallway outside Adeline's room before he opened the door, an old reflex from the weeks when checking on her had felt less like a habit and more like a necessity. He noticed himself doing it less with each month that passed, and he let himself count that, quietly, as its own kind of proof that the fear was finally loosening its grip. He thought of that, months later, standing at the courthouse steps beside Adeline on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, watching her check the crosswalk both ways out of habit before she'd even reached for his hand. "Come on," she said. "You're going to be late." Barrett smiled, and for the first time since the night he'd found a stranger's handwriting circling his daughter's schedule, walked through his own front door without checking twice to see who else might already be inside. The exhibit list stayed in his desk drawer for years after that, tucked beneath ordinary paperwork nobody else had reason to move. Not as a trophy, just as a fact he wanted within reach. Every so often, on the slow afternoons between cases, he'd take it out, run his thumb across the one altered line only he and Opal had ever known to look for, and remind himself that the truth rarely announced itself loudly. It simply waited, patient as a locked door, for someone careful enough to notice which key actually fit.